Have there been
Yeah.
times, so those been times where you felt kind of demeaned or just not valued? Have there been times where you've been outright blocked or like almost people
Mm.
have turned their back, like we've heard about Beth Moore teaching and people stood up and turned their
Yeah.
back or left,
Yeah.
you know?
Yep. So a very formative story in my seminary years. I was working at a church. That particular church was fairly kind of ambivalent on women in leadership. They were part of an association of churches that were ambivalent, and I was the youth pastor there. I was ambivalent on women in leadership at this point. I think it was my second year in seminary, and but I also felt called to preach, and I had like an opportunity as like the youth Sunday. I did like the youth Sunday. And so I was like, okay, that's okay. It's youth Sunday. Like whatever Paul is saying in scripture, youth Sunday is fine, you know?
Yeah.
And then the lead pastor, he went out of town. And so I was going to preach. And there was a gentleman there. It was a smaller congregation. There was a gentleman there who there was kind of the rumors of he's not in favor of women being in leadership. He's not okay with it. And so I showed up. It was Thanksgiving weekend. Show up to preach, and I was kind of greeted from I think one of the leaders, and he was like, "Hey, we think so and so. We think he might do something."
That particular person.
That particular guy. We think we might do something. I was like, "What do you know?"
Yeah.
And I'm 23 at the time, and I'm like texting people back home from Florida. I'm like, "Hey, pray for me. They think this guy might do something." And so we go into the service, and I'm sitting there, and it's my time to get up to preach. And this gentleman gets to the front. He turns. He says, "Sorry, Katie, change of plans." And then he proceeds to say all of his reasons why women should not be allowed to preach. The interesting thing was he was not, you couldn't really understand what he was saying. It wasn't very coherent or audible. And so one of the leaders of the church starts making his way forward. And I am like, okay, thank God.
Yeah.
They're going to tell me you can't interrupt.
Well,
I'm sitting.
Okay.
I'm front row, just kind of like the song's about to end. I'm ready.
Time to go. Yeah.
So the leader of the church starts going forward. I'm like, okay, great. You can't do this. You can't disrupt a worship service. I've been tasked with preaching. So the leader of the church gets to the front, gets to the gentleman who's sharing his reasons why women should not be allowed to preach. And the leader comes up and he adjusts his mic so that he can be heard better throughout the auditorium. The leader just said, "Let me fix your mic."
For the guy who was speaking up against you? Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And I was like, I just remember I had this dear friend from seminary. He came to support me, and he just like reached over, like holds my hand, through this. So the guy leaves. He walks out with his wife, and I go forward. And these are the things I remember. I remember him saying, "Sorry, Katie, change of plans." And then I got up and I said, "You need to know, I come up here with fear and trembling. Like, I don't take this lightly, this being tasked to speak for God, to preach," right? And again, at that point, I was not fully, women should be allowed to preach.
Yeah, so I'm sure it's going, like you're going, yeah, maybe you're right.
Well, that's the thing, though, is I don't think I thought that. I think I was like, God is for me in this moment. And so as I looked back on that experience, even like that weekend, like that Thanksgiving weekend, as I'm processing what just happened, I felt like, okay, God was for me in that moment. God was not ready to like strike me down with a bolt of lightning. I was, so that was actually a really important part of my story of, okay, what do I do with that? And what hurt the most was the lack of support from the leadership of that church.
So more the guy who adjusted the mic.
Right. And the aftermath, where it was never really addressed. It was never really, I'm so sorry that happened. That's not okay. Or dealing with this guy, like that never really happened. So that was really the more painful part. But as far as my own understanding of call, that was actually a really key experience of, I think God was for me as I got up to preach.
Deeply rooted sense. Wow. In the midst of that, public. Wow. How would you said Andy Crouch has helped help you understand power. How do you understand it or define it now?
Yeah. Well, I think I would go back to, some of Andy Crouch's stuff around, that we are called to make something beautiful of God's world with God. And that power, that agency, that ability do so, to make something beautiful. And the way that is, that does require that vulnerability, that we get in trouble when those get separated or divorced, but that the agency, the ability to create, to join with God and what God is doing.
So let's talk also about power dynamics, like the differential, so in your light of your understanding of like that agency, how does that work when there's like a power dynamic, or is there a differential, or how does that, your understanding of power, fit into that, the idea of power dynamics?
Yeah, I think for me, that is something that I'm slowly realizing I need to wrestle with. I think, I don't know how true this is. I want to hear you. I want to flip.
Okay.
I want to hear your take on this. As a woman, what does it look like to recognize where I have power and where the power differential is, where if I haven't, maybe as women, we haven't always had that seat at the table or been able to lead and exercise the power that God is calling us to exercise. So I guess I'm saying for a long time, I almost maybe skirted it, no pun intended, as a woman, of like, I didn't maybe see the need as much because we are a little bit more of a marginalized voice.
Yeah.
And so now I'm like, oh, wait, okay, now I've been a lead pastor for 4 years, working so much with folks who have been deeply harmed by the church. Like this way of like, yeah, sure, it may be different than Chuck, my husband, who shows up as a white man, that there's a difference there, but certainly as a white woman, how do I reckon with that and recognize that? And so I think, through like some mutual friends, Matt Tebby and Ben Starkey, and like just realizing like, yeah, it is a little bit different how I show up as a woman who's a pastor. I think that that does matter. I feel it even in our context, a lot of folks who are very skeptical of the church. And I think when Chuck says, I'm a pastor, that hits differently than when I say, I'm a pastor.
Yeah.